Welcome to another episode of Four Guys Talking About AI. Looking forward to our conversation here. We've got Greg Sterling, Neil Polacek, and John Gerard with me. Hey guys, how's it going?
Awesome.
Good. Excited to be here.
Excellent. All right, well, let's jump into it. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about hallucinations and what's going on with AI and hallucinations and what do you do about it. John, why don't you lead off with what are hallucinations in the first place, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so this is such a fascinating area of generative AI. And really what it refers to is this tendency of generative AI. And by that, I mean, you type in something to ChatGPT and say, hey, answer this question. That's generative AI. It's generating a text response back. It's the tendency of generative AI to just make stuff up when it answers or when it produces a result. It's really crazy. It cropped up very early on as these models were being developed, and looks very quirky and very strange. And to give an example of what that might look like, it's possible if you ask for what companies has John Gerard worked at in the past, that it will actually make up businesses that I never worked at. And turn those back around in the answer in ways that aren't equivocal at all. So like very, very, with a high degree of confidence reports something absolutely false.
It's very authoritative, isn't it?
It's very authoritative.
High degree of confidence is exactly it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, obviously it's funny and interesting and also potentially a really big problem.
Well, isn't it in some ways mimicking what some people do?
It's interesting you say it that way. So that is probably exactly what is happening. Because the way that generative AI works mimics neural processes. These are all based on neural nets, and we based our the engineering of those neural nets on actual neural networks in our brains. It is thought to be fairly closely mimicking the way that we word find. So like I start this sentence and I'm not quite sure where it's going to end. What I am doing at some level in the sort of neural nets in my brain is the same thing ChatGPT does, which is I have this sort of general idea of what I'm trying to say.
And
then I pick the next word based on what the most likely highest probability next word would be once I get to this point in the sentence, right? So like once I get to now the most likely next word is this, and then the most likely next word is point, etc. So that's exactly the way ChatGPT handles it, and our brains do too. Sometimes ChatGPT can't determine what the statistically most likely next word is and have that align with reality. So it chooses the statistically most likely next word out of the blue. So John Gerard used to work at, and it doesn't have anything to put there. So it just goes Cisco. Why not? Let's do Cisco.
So the inspiration for this came from a New York Times article that said hallucination is much more common than people realize, and it creates a practical problem. I'm using ChatGPT every single day for different things, for different purposes, and when people start inputting their data or start relying on it, trusting it to give you correct answers, these kind of subtle mistakes, or everybody knows when there's a major hallucination, right? So if you ask a question that you already know the answer to and it doesn't correspond, that's an error. Or if you're doing a math problem, you can independently check that on a calculator or using your brain. But if you're using a big data set, or if you're using a lot of content, you upload a document, you're asking questions about that document, and it starts hallucinating, or it's misinterpreting that information, the data or the content. As a practical matter, how do you deal with that? It sort of defeats the purpose if you have to go back and fact check everything that you're doing, right?
Right.
So how do you kind of think about, when do I need to really investigate this, and when can I just rely on it? Having said that, I just rely on everything, and I don't do any fact checking unless it's like, are you sure that this is right? It doesn't seem right to me. Why don't you check it again?
Even if you do that, it can still make up an answer. And so we spend a lot of time focusing on this at Composer because we want our content that we write to be factual and correct. There's a concept called RAG data. RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. And what it is it's the process of outputting new data that you feed into it that's factual. So for example, you can upload case studies, or you can upload research or any kind of other factual information about a company and use that as RAG data as input to the LLM that overrides and supersedes what the LLM might generate. And what'll happen is that when you do that and you enter in that RAG data, you're essentially training the LLM to say, this is factual information. Use this as source data when you write content and you reference that information. And that is, the RAG data is sort of the cure, the fix for for hallucinations in general.
Are the hallucinations necessarily a bad thing? I mean, like, is that sort of the creative side of this thing? Is that giving some creative juice to this stuff? And is it allowing kind of the response to be broader and different than we might have predicted? I mean, is it all bad, I guess, is the question I'm posing.
Yeah.
I think it depends entirely on the context. Sometimes it might be interesting. You might get an interesting, if you're doing something creative or looking for ideas or whatever, in that situation, it might be interesting.
I'll tell you one the experience I had where it was exactly as you said, which is it was incredibly useful. And I think actually a whole company could be built around this. So I was using some app or another. I can't remember what it was. I think I'd try out dozens of apps, like way too many. And I couldn't figure out how to do something in it. And so I went into the little chat thing, and they had very recently implemented an AI chat response for their help, which a lot of people are doing now. And so I said, hey, I need to connect this second calendar to my account. How do I do that? And it said AI generating response. And it gave me a very complete step-by-step answer. Open this menu, go to this place, open this thing up, click here. The problem was that menu did not exist. Like it was a pure invention. It was a pure hallucination. Now, if I'm a product person,
it just gave you a roadmap.
It gave me a roadmap. It gave me the perfect solution for the UX associated or UI associated with, where that particular feature should be. So, there's a great example of the bug is actually a feature, I think, in hallucinations in certain cases. And I suspect we're going to see a lot of people making use of that kind of invention that, and creativity, that sort of creativity that comes out in hallucinations for various products.
There's also a dimension. It's such a fascinating use case. I would say the flip side to that is bad data is, just bad information. It's not reliable. And so therefore, what ends up happening is that people try AI and they have a bad experience with it, or it's not putting out the results that they want. And they say, oh, this AI stuff's too early. It's not ready yet. And it's just not the case. It's just they're not using it properly. There's in addition to all of this, there's this concept called temperature in the AI, right? And the temperature is a range of how creative you want the AI to be, right? So think of it as like a slider. And when you make the temperature really high, it tells the LLM to be creative. And when you make it really low, it's very explicit, right? And so there is, you can adjust that. And when you adjust that, and you adjust it higher in some cases, and this is all use case driven, but when you adjust it higher, it can have a tendency to create more hallucinations as opposed to being more factual. And so
you're giving it freedom to go beyond the literal and what it knows.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And what that's actually doing, which is fascinating, is saying, like, how strict should it be about the statistical likelihood of the next word? So if you say it has to be very, very, very likely, then it actually ends up choosing and creating sentences that are super bland. They sound really flat because they just use extremely high likelihood words. And actually, one of the things that we think probably makes language interesting is occasionally choosing a word that's a little bit off center, that's a little bit different than what our brain's expecting. It sort of sparks a little like, ooh, that was nicely said. So when you set the temperature really high, the AI doesn't do any of that. When you set it really low, it does so much of it that you can barely understand what it is that it's saying.
You mean the opposite, John, right? When you set it high, it's
the higher
more
it's creative.
The higher temperature, actually, that's a good question. I guess I don't remember.
The higher the temperature, the more creative it is.
Okay. I didn't remember which was which. So the higher temperature is, that's right. It would basically say, you can lower the statistical threshold at the higher temperature. Like it can just be kind of likely. It doesn't have to be very likely.
Yeah.
Thanks for that correction.
And so the tendency is that when you set it that way, it can hallucinate. And so there's this balance of having a creative output, which you want it to do to some extent, but you want to keep it within the box. And then you also augment with RAG data so that you can draw on factual information when it creates content.
So it turns out, actually, on the subject of temperature, you can actually adjust that in the prompt in ChatGPT, which is kind of cool. And you can kind of see some of this impact yourself of like more creative or less creative. And just to give a quick example that I think is kind of funny. So I put in a really quick prompt that says, tell a 1-paragraph story about a man in a lighthouse, set the temperature to 0.01. So just as a reminder, extremely low temperature means very, very flat, not super creative. So here's the first sentence of that. In a quiet coastal village, an elderly lighthouse keeper named Thomas carefully maintained the beacon every day. Each morning he ascended the spiral staircase, cleaned the lens, et cetera, et cetera. It sounds a little like Hemingway to me. I don't know about what you guys think, but very simple. Mm-hmm. So tell the same story, but set the temperature to 0.9. On a fog-draped coast where the mist clung to rocks like spectral fingers, the old lighthouse keeper Thomas diligently tended to his towering sentinel that pierced the darkness with its rotating beam. So you can see that there's a pretty big difference, and you can actually see like why you might want one end of that and not the other. I don't know how that landed for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, one is overly overwritten, and you'd be exhausted reading a book written that way.
Right.
You wouldn't finish the book. You'd be exhausted early on. Whereas the other one, you'd fall asleep.
When I was
one you'd fall asleep at 0.1, you'd fall asleep, and it's kind of boring. Yeah. And at 0.9, you'd be exhausted reading all the flowery words. So you know,
I would just comment that it's remarkable that the machine can do this in the first place.
While you were, while we were doing the call.
Yeah, isn't that funny?
Well, no, not just that a machine has that kind of capability. I mean, putting aside whether we like the Hemingway version or the romance novel version or whatever, it's remarkable that this is possible.
Yeah.
I mean, I could rationally understand the sequencing of the language based on some large language model, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm amazed by it, by the capability.
That's such a good point. Because the deeper you go into this, the more easy it is to forget just how incredible it is. And that really is. That's a really good point. Now I kind of want to read more about Thomas and the Lighthouse.
Yeah.
It could be a children's book that you then...
Thomas and the Train.
Right.
Yeah. Thomas the Tank Engine.
Yeah.
You could start a career, John, as a children's book author based on this.
I think I might just do that. Let me get back into ChatGPT.
All right.
So let's move on to another topic. I mean, we can talk about hallucination for a long time, but let's talk about something that Neil brought up, which was discovery about AI discovery, right? We're all people in the B2B world, the technology world, who are looking at LinkedIn and listening to podcasts and getting fairly reliable information from these sources. But there's another world of AI information that's out there on social media, and specifically TikTok. Neil, what did you discover this week?
So somebody had told me that, some of the stuff we're talking about should be posted there. And so I just decided to, open my app and start to play around. And I looked for small business AI tools. And I was just amazed by how much is already in there. How many people are talking about, here are the 5 best tools, here are the 6 best tools, here are the 10 best tools. Interestingly, many of those tools, as I sort of went through these, what are they, feeds or whatever you call them, TikToks, I don't know what they're called, but a lot of them were video applications. And to me, that was really interesting because they're talking about video applications, how to take a long form video and chop it up into, guess what, TikTok, whatever they call them, Reels, TikToks, or whatever.
Yeah.
And there were dozens in there, and these people were pretty passionate about these being the 10 best, these being the 5 best, these being whatever. And just that a business owner could go there and start to figure out how to do their own video creation and start to get into this stuff is really interesting to me. And there must be businesses in there looking. Otherwise, there wouldn't be this content being posted there. So there's getting some uptake on this stuff. I don't. Have you guys been in there to look for stuff and just explore? Because I was by it.
Early on, I was getting a lot of AI content in my feeds. There were certain people who were doing, who were reporting when ChatGPT first came out or when Gemini first came out. There were a lot of people who were talking about them and what they were and sort of demystifying these tools. Lately, I've just steered clear of that, so I get a lot of recipes and random stuff. I'm not paying attention to the AI stuff anymore. I don't engage with it, so I don't get any more of it in my feed. But you're right that there's you can find anything under the sun in TikTok. It's really fascinating in that way, and it can be genuinely useful for people. People who don't use TikTok don't really understand what's in there. They think it's just a bunch of people doing silly things or lip syncing or whatever it is. But there's a lot of interesting content and a lot of content aimed at a lot of marketing related content. But you don't necessarily know who to trust. I mean, if somebody's saying here are the 5 tools, you can check them out yourself and make your own assessment. But there's a lot of advice being given about marketing and AI in particular, and it's unclear who's reliable and who's not.
But just as a discovery tool, I mean, that to me that a lot. I mean, is that easier than going to Capterra or G2 and going, give me an AI tool for video? I mean, just go to TikTok where they're doing it. I mean,
well, it's just.
I was going to say that to me, that I think that TikTok in that kind of discovery mode is a threat to Gartner's business and G2 and those kind of review platforms, because it's so much more convenient to have somebody do a quick demo of it in a video.
And that's what they're doing.
Exactly. And it's fascinating. And so the reliability factor comes into question for sure, where a lot of that gets answered is either in the comments or in the views of those videos. And that's where people look at metrics to see how reliable that kind of message is.
Well, interesting, Andy,
what were you going to say?
You bring up the Capterra and G2 stuff, because in the survey work that Greg and I did for Dialogue, we found that these businesses, they don't really refer to that stuff. They don't. That is not a place for them to go to get answers on what kind of software to buy.
Yeah,
I mean, would you say that's Greg?
Yeah, I mean, it's a relatively low, out of 15 or 16 channels or sources of information, it's pretty low for these business owners versus other things. Word of mouth is high in all of these cases, which is a version of what you're getting on TikTok. You don't know the person, but you're hearing a testimonial, or you're hearing a first person experience, which is very much like word of mouth, and it's much more vivid than going to a Capterra page and trying to look at all the text,
Yeah, I think that this phenomenon of sort of moving away from like the G2s and Capterras and into these kind of like social spaces for reviewing products, it's sort of an example of the bigger problem that Google is having. Like, part of the reason that G2 and Capterra have worked is because they did such a good job of optimizing to be found when somebody says, what's an alternative to Microsoft Word, right? Like they've SEO'd the heck out of that so that they show up in those results. When that happens, so they've gamed the system. When that happens, the companies that have products that are represented there want to game the system as well so that they show up higher in those rankings.
They get all the reviews, they push the reviews.
So all of a sudden, like, what you have is the people who have done a good job with SEO, and not the people who built good products. And by the way, again, this is happening everywhere with Google, and is probably, well, some people speculating may be the end of their search business, because it's gotten so bad and AI is displacing things so rapidly. One of the things that has come up to displace is these short form videos in TikTok and YouTube and elsewhere.
Well, Google's indexing those. So Google is trying to compensate for this defection, that especially younger users, to Reddit and to TikTok and to YouTube, by indexing all that content, you know,
Yep.
and some people would argue that that's starting to distort what you're seeing in search results, especially around the forums, Reddit and Quora and things like that. And Quora is especially unreliable. Reddit somewhat less so, although people are starting to spam it for the reasons you already described, John. It's a sort of a parasite SEO strategy, or barnacle SEO, which is the industry term.
Yeah. Ooh, I like that. Barnacle SEO.
Well, that's I have to give attribution to Will Scott of Search Influence, who coined that term many years ago.
That's
so
amazing.
people use the term without doing it. But you know, just back on the search thing, TikTok and Instagram are being used for certain categories of discoveries for search more heavily than Google is for people under 25, right? It's not across the board, but it's certain categories. And so there is a real threat. I mean, Google hasn't seen a major loss of traffic or market share, whatever, but there is a threat. And, you know, I mean, there's this, we don't have to go into this in length, but there is this rumor that ChatGPT is going to launch a search engine, which is a direct threat to Google or a direct competitor with Google. They already have access to Bing, but it's not a great search experience. You know, there's another engine, Perplexity, which is trying to be much more of a direct competitor, and that does a pretty good job of giving you an alternative to Google. And we'll see if this thing happens with ChatGPT or not. In the, you know, it's supposed to happen this week or maybe next week.
Yeah, there's news about it this week about search.openai.
That one, Perplexity, is one I recommend everybody try out. Like it's for me, Perplexity is now 60 or 70% of my searches. Where Google used to be 100%, Google's now less than half of my own personal searches, and most of them are going to Perplexity right now. Like that feels disruptive. I realize I'm not everybody.
I'm in the same boat. I don't exactly have that same breakdown, but I'm using Google 50% less than I did, and I'm using other things. And it feels like Google is really noisy, and the quality of the results there's just a lot of work involved in sifting through results to find what you want. A lot of lead gen, a lot of self-promotional content. It's very hard to get good information unless you're going exactly for some specific document or something that you already know exists.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep. Looking for the latest restaurant, Google's a great spot. You know, the rest of the searches that I do, it's not a great spot.
You know, what's interesting is you probably have experienced this. Tell me if you have, but once you start using, whether it's OpenAI or Complexity or whatever LLM you use, you start getting really specific about what you're looking for in those searches, and you get the results back. And then you go to Google and use the same query, and it's just a very different experience at that point.
That's right.
And so we're kind of getting trained on getting a specific answer with our query using AI. And then you go back to Google and you're like, that doesn't, you know, it's not really answering my question. I got to hunt for an answer.
We're getting the full answer of how to do something, you know, how to make something, right? You do that in Google. I want a recipe for miso salad dressing. It gives you a bunch of links. You do that in these things, and it says, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this.
This is where the hallucination may come in.
Yeah, exactly.
You may get a totally hallucinated recipe in that case. I mean, I would not trust ChatGPT for recipes at all.
Oh, I've used it. It works great.
That's so funny.
Well, you know, it's also talking about recipes. I saw this really interesting video where this guy was comparing the user experiences side by side. Right, here are the results with ChatGPT, and boom, you get your results. Then he did his search on Google, clicked on the first link, went to a page, pop up, you know, all kinds of noise. You got to scroll down the page, 3/4 of the way down the page. There's finally the recipe and the data load also, and how quick it took to get to your answer. Thought it was fast side by side.
It is $100 billion ad business or whatever Google is these days. I mean, they have to.
Oh, it's more than that. It's much more.
Well, whatever it is.
They've got a problem.
It's like 150 billion.
Like, yeah, this is innovator's dilemma stuff. It's going to be extremely challenging.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is that like 70% or 80%, depending on the data you look at, of search behavior on Google is for so-called informational queries, where people are looking for high-level information, answers to questions. They're not looking to transact necessarily. They're not looking to evaluate a specific product. that forms a smaller subset of the total query volume. And this is where these AI tools really shine, is this informational search arena, which is partly why Google has pumped what it calls the search generative experience. Now they're calling them AI answers, I think, into the experimental version of Google that you get when you opt into Labs. And the rumor is they're going to formally launch that at their developer conference next week. But they're trying to compensate for what you guys are describing by pushing, all this AI content into the top of search results, which impacts the visibility of these other sites that get pushed way down the page.
And the ads.
And so there's all this hand wringing. Well, the ads are protected, right? I mean, Google is taking great care to make sure the ads are visible, to integrate advertising into these AI answers. They're still working through it, but they're not going to push the ads down the page. They're going to protect that at all costs.
I think it's fascinating that Perplexity has chosen to be an ad-driven company. That's their business model now, and that to me is a really interesting choice. I don't know if you guys read about that, but seen. Yeah, there's it out.
Well, what's interesting. I mean, it sort of goes with their presenting themselves as a Google alternative in a certain ironic way. But I think, it raises the question of how many of these chat, engines can survive or coexist. Because, how many are people going to use? How many? Originally Perplexity, and all of them have a kind of pro version. ChatGPT, Gemini, Google Gemini, Perplexity did. Claude has one. Yeah, paid version.
Paid. It reminds me of AltaVista and InfoSeek and At Home back in the day, and how that all played out. I'm not sure how it's going to play out. Maybe Google buys Perplexity or something like that at some point, but there's going to be some consolidation in that space.
There's also this funny loyalty problem. It was not a problem for me at all to switch to ChatGPT from Google, and it wasn't a problem for me at all to switch from other way around. Google, to switch from Google to ChatGPT, and then from ChatGPT to Perplexity. I just stopped using ChatGPT and started using Perplexity. So that's the other weird thing about this explosion of options is what's actually sticky anymore.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how many of these it's sort of like the streaming problem, right? There are 7, 8, 9, 10 streaming channels depending on how you count it, and how many subscriptions are you going to pay for?
At least with Spotify, it gets to know me, and there's a reason for me to stick around because it has sort of
you've trained it.
Yeah, right. And it's trained me. I believe, whether it's 100% true or not, I believe that it knows my taste and is able to offer up, stuff that's relevant to me. And that's a reason to stay and not explore something else. And I just don't think that the current sort of crop of tools has any lever like that built into them.
Well, the memory function that, was for ChatGPT might do some of that, but I don't know how deep that goes,
Yeah.
And Google's got to walk a fine line with this because they have more data about you than you know, and they don't have a creepy experience for anybody at the same time. So it's a fine line to walk for sure. Let's change gears a little bit. Neil, you mentioned earlier that you wrote a blog post this week.
I read a piece by a woman named I think her name's Joanne Chen. She's a partner at some VC firm. She was writing about this shift from SaaS, SaaS, to SaaS, software as a service, to services as software, and she was making the case that that there's $4.6 trillion of value that is going to float around, and these AI tools that actually do the outbound calling for you could replace some of that $4.6 trillion.
Yep.
And that the business model will be really interesting because what will it say? Like, am I going to set a sales objective with a machine? Like, how many outbound calls are you going to do? How many completes are you going to do? It's going to be fascinating to see that shift in business model. And it's not a seat license anymore. Now it's a performance model, which I think is going to be incredibly interesting. And she puts the number, like I said, of $4.6 trillion of activity available for these AI tools to go capture. And connected to that conversation, I was having a conversation with my friend of mine who works at a big credit card company. And he was talking about, how there are, really moral questions that are floating around these really large enterprises where they have hundreds of thousands of employees. And the moral question is like, what are we going to do here? Like, are we going to really implement these tools such that these people are no longer going to be necessarily needed? And so it was the two conversations connected for me and said, there's some really large issues down the road, really significant.
I think it's a total fantasy that you're just going to push a button and then your leads are going to come in all via automated AI tools, AI outbound calling with synthetic voices and all of that. I think that's a complete fantasy. I think, what you may get is
yeah,
on her part, not the machine. I mean, VCs tend to be expansive and upbeat and look at the great opportunity in the sector. Certainly AI is disruptive. Certainly AI is a productivity tool and will be used in all kinds of interesting ways. I mean, there was a CMO survey that found only 7% of respondents, these were enterprises, were actually using generative AI in their marketing. So, we all assume from our own experience and people we talk to, adoption is all over the place, but it wasn't at a high level, according to this one survey, at least. I think we will see certain kinds of tasks automated, but I don't think it's going to be the sort of panacea. That was the fantasy of chatbots for customer service. You put a Drift bot on your site, and it's going to take care of everything. And in fact, you just want to get the hell out of there to get to the human, right? So I think I think the future is more nuanced and complicated than we're going to press a button and other leads will just come streaming in.
Yeah, I agree with the statement about it being nuanced. I think that's a big deal. I think my view is a little different than yours, although I think we get to the same place. I think that there's actually no technical reason that would stop these agents from being effective in just doing this at the push of a button. Like we're getting
email marketing for sure. Email marketing for sure.
Even voice latency is getting shorter and shorter. It'll only improve. Responses are getting smarter and smarter. That will only improve. I actually think that the slowdown in that might come from backlash. I think that actually we're going to move into a place here where people who are on the receiving end of these communications are going to feel like they're being cheated because they're not talking to a real human, and the thing is trying to pretend like it's a human. And we're going to get this classic cheating and cheating detection arms race. So, like, how do I determine whether this thing is actually real that's talking to me? And you can imagine there's spam filters and bot filters now. I suspect there will be AI filters that try to detect AI signals and reject interactions that are coming probably from AI. And that's where I would see one of the friction points coming from in this adoption.
And yet, if it can do a little bit of work and have a little bit of success,
hallelujah,
and do a little outbound selling and bring back a live customer or a warm lead,
it's remarkable.
That's pretty compelling.
There's a very cool, interesting service that recently came out. It's called VAPI. And it's a platform that has this very low latency voice driven AI that you can build a whole voice platform on, right? So you can have it make outbound calls, and it's a two-way chat, kind of environment. It plugs into ChatGPT on the back end, so it can source all that data and use all that information in real time
in a response,
in a conversation. So everything that you see being written down in ChatGPT gets verbally delivered through their platform. and the latency is remarkable. I'd recommend checking it out because, John, to your point, the stuff is getting better and better. That's the best I've seen so far. And there are going to be a lot of these services that are built on it. The difference is, what is the use case? Because, Greg, I agree with you. I don't think that it's going to be, you push a button and you get 100 leads delivered to you. I think that they're going to be, maybe the first use case is like an IVR plus, kind of thing.
Customer service, for sure.
Customer service is a great use case. And sales is also a great use case, but sales to a point, right? So it's not going to necessarily make the sale for you, but it could qualify the opportunity. Or maybe instead of your salespeople banging out phone calls, calling dead lines, maybe all it does is it calls those people, says, hey, I'm trying to connect with you. Want to just make sure that now's a good time to talk. If it is, great. Let me connect you with, my boss and whoever it is, and have you have this conversation. I could see healthcare being a great, right.
I can imagine that.
Healthcare, you've got all these patients that need to get called back by the doctor or by somebody in the office, and people aren't available, or it goes to voicemail, or they don't recognize the phone number, or what have you. If you have a bot making those calls and then you connect with somebody and it says, hey, I'm calling to schedule your appointment, is now a good time to do that? Great. Let me connect you to our booking agent and we'll connect you in. That to me is a really great use case.
Yeah, but Andy, as you said that, and I can imagine a physician's office, your lab work was great, Neil, and that's delivered not by a nurse, not by a physician, but by some bot that's better than maybe getting that in a text form, and their HIPAA issues and all those things. But all right, I got to see it. I got to believe it's going to happen.
I'm sorry, but we found a dark spot on your lung.
Right.
Well, I think to call back and say your labs look great will be the first. Well, they'll try that before they try there's a spot here, like.
I think they're
via AI. I'll just be clear about that.
I think there are a lot of use cases. I don't want to sound like a Luddite. I think there are a lot of use cases, but I think they have to be thoughtful, and people can't just make assumptions. You have to really be thoughtful about the implementation, for sure.
And people are going to try use cases and they'll fail, just like, a lot of stuff fails, and then they'll find some others that are home runs and really, really substantively change how businesses operate. And that's only going to happen by trial and error.
All right. On that optimistic note.
All right. Well, I think, this has been a great conversation today. Love all the topics that we're covering here. There's going to be more. There's tons more in this space. I'm glad we got a chance to drill into hallucinations a little bit. John, do you want to maybe wrap it up with your final thought on hallucinations before we break?
Yeah. So here's a little dystopian final point around hallucinations. So one of the problems that people are talking about around hallucinations is that AI models are now actually getting trained on AI content. So there's this sort of recursive thing happening. And there's at least some people speculating that there may be a world where enough hallucinations pushed out into the ecosystem that now new models train on all of that AI content, which, by the way, probably isn't written with the same pizzazz and enthusiasm that humans do it, and may have hallucinations baked into it. Now we're in a really strange world where even the kind of fact checking you might want to try to do to clear that up doesn't work anymore, because the models are being trained on content created by previous versions of themselves that had all kinds of stuff in it. So hard problem to solve, not unsolvable. But there's a lot of work that's going to be needed to be done to navigate something like that.
You have to imagine that all of these companies are focused on reducing hallucinations, and the next version, whether it's GPT-5 that comes out or whatever the next generation is for all of these platforms, is addressing that problem squarely. They know that this is a huge problem, and in order for them to be a trustable source, they're going to have to deal with it. And my guess is that, that's more of a platform issue and less of a try to fix the issue with a interim solution. Great one. All right. Well, thanks so much. Tune in next time for our continue a conversation about AI. Thanks so much for listening.
Yep. Take care, you guys.
Thanks, everybody.